What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my thoughts on Vrising, which launched into its 1.0 version just a few days ago, and while I don't plan on fully reviewing the title, which I'll get to in a second, I did want to give people a video discussing my actual opinions on it, as for its launch, I had a video that was sponsored by the game's publisher and developer Stunlock Studios, and in general, I prefer to keep videos like that pretty free of opinions as best I can, and stick to the more cut and dry aspects of it. That said, I mentioned this isn't going to be a full review, so what do I mean by that? Well, basically, I think Vrising is a really cool game. However, that is a game that focuses pretty heavily on a multiplayer aspect of it. There is PvP, co-op, a clan system, and a bunch of other multiplayer-centric features that I personally simply just don't have an interest in. And for people like myself, it is possible to play the game entirely by yourself, but doing that and then making a review based on that experience that doesn't even touch on the big multiplayer part of the game would be a pretty big oversight, so instead of doing that, I wanted to do a video like this and share some extended thoughts on it free of the context of a sponsored video for those people who had specifically asked for exactly that. With all of that said, as I'm sure you probably know, Vrising is a sort of ARPG meets survival builder where we play as a vampire. We've recently awoken from our slumber and need to regain our power so we can take the fight to none other than Dracula, whose own reemergence sort of triggered our own. We're going to do that by building up our own castle, our own minions, our own gear and research, to get us as close as possible to the top of the food chain, so to speak, so we can put an end to our age-old rivalry with Dracula. Now, very broad strokes, I think Vrising is a really cool game. I think it does a lot of things really, really well. I enjoy the castle building. The combat is even pretty fun. But there's also other parts where I think it stumbles a little bit. For starters, I think the gear progression is pretty linear. The decay mechanics that see certain aspects of your castle, etc., only staying up for so long before starting to decay based on your resources. The time it takes to actually craft things individually can be very long if you're playing by yourself, for instance. So there's a few places where I think some improvements could definitely be made. But to kick things off, let's first talk about making a game. As I mentioned, it is a multiplayer title. So when it comes to actually starting one up, you can choose to play just fully online, joining an already existing server, or setting up your own private game, which you can choose to make a solo experience, or you could go so far as to make it a LAN-only experience. Or if you would prefer to set up your own server, you can either do that with an existing server or rent one out as well. Now, assuming you're making your own private game, you'll have an option between 3 different difficulty modes: relaxed, normal, or brutal, or easy, normal, hard if you prefer, or instead you could choose advanced game settings, which allows you to customize a whole host of individual options that let you customize just about every aspect of a private game or private server if you prefer, which honestly I think is really cool, because this way you can either choose to join a server that already has all these rules in place and thus you are aware of what you're agreeing to, which does include a whole host of official servers, with one thing you need to watch out there though being that a lot of those servers come with scheduled wipes. That is to say, they reset progress every so often, which for all of the official servers I believe is every 6 months. And while not every server does that, and any one you set up for yourself doesn't need to do that, it's definitely something to be aware of. Overall, I will say that I really like the fact that you can set up your own dedicated server, and I think all the options around choosing the exact experience you want here in terms of all these modifiers you can adjust and change is fantastic, and something I always enjoy seeing in games. Now, once you've got all that set up, there is a quick cosmetic-oriented character customization. It's nothing crazy, but for an isometric game is better than nothing. And from there, you're set off into the actual open world, free to do and set up things how you please. Now, right away, the map here is set, but there are dynamic elements to it, so while a lot of things are always in the same place, there are events and things like that happening throughout the world that you can interact with that will change, which combined with some of the basic survival elements here, can make it interesting enough to move through even an area you've been to many times. But let's talk about surviving out here. So we are a vampire, of course, which means we need to avoid the sun during daytime, You can be out during the day, you simply have to stick to shaded areas as you don't want to get caught in direct sunlight for too long before you start taking damage, but otherwise it's not too big of a deal. But the other part of it is of course blood, as our vampire needs blood, which is represented through a few different things. For starters, we got blood type and blood quality. Depending on where you feed from, be it animal, human, etc., they all have different types of blood. Each type of blood gives you a tiered bonus based on the blood quality of that type that you drank. Blood quality is 1 to 100%, and the higher the blood quality, the bigger bonuses you'll get for that particular type of blood. A pretty cool system overall, and it does make what you choose to feed on a bit of a choice, especially if you've had a really good blood quality recently, and suddenly you need blood, but the only available sources are low quality. So there's some decisions to be made there, and it's compelling enough for what it is. But then we need to get building. Now, in terms of gathering, pretty standard stuff. One of the first few things you'll build is your basic tools, which is going to allow you to harvest basic materials out in the world, which you're going to use to set up your initial castle, to get you access to better resources and better weapons and tools, which will allow you to harvest better materials and the like, which allows you to then of course build more elaborate and complex things and make your castle all that much fancier. Pretty standard build cycle overall, and the game's built-in objective system does a pretty good job in keeping you on track towards what you should be working for, which means you don't have to worry too much about, say, getting lost in all the options, but overall I would say building is pretty fun. Now when it comes to building your castle, you need to go find an unoccupied plot of land. These are all marked on your map, so they're very easy to find, and once you find one you like, you can set down your castle heart, which is just that, the heart of your castle, but this needs to be powered by blood essences normally, depending on your game settings of course, in order to not decay. But that's mostly more of a thing on the multiplayer servers. Now, one of the cool things about the plots of land here is that you can actually build up a few different floors. I believe it's 3 at a max, if my memory serves. I don't remember exactly what the max floor limit is anymore. But in addition to just the available space on your plot, you can eventually build castle stairs that will allow you to build a second floor area and give yourself even more room than it might initially appear. Now, should you get bored of this, they recently added the ability to relocate your castle, which I thought was a nice touch, especially because you'll be moving around this fairly large map pretty regularly, as a lot of the portions of the game, which we're about to get into, are separated into the different areas of the map. That is to say, enemies will need to track down. But by and large, building feels pretty good. If anything, I would say it's very similar to every other builder you've ever played, with of course that sort of gothic vampire flair. But the actual act of building out your castle is a lot of fun, especially when you start unlocking more and more specific aspects of it, like the ability to build out your own garden or dominate humans to turn them into your servants and send them out to gather resources for you, for instance. Later, you can even potentially have them defending your keep against either monsters that wander a little too close or other players if you happen to be going the PvP route. But basically, there's a surprising amount of what you can customize in terms of your base, and it's pretty much required, as progressing your base and keeping it up to date is what's going to give you access to the better and better materials and thus tiers of equipment. Now, outside of just the visual aspects of keeping your castle up to date, it also serves a few different other purposes. So for starters, this is where you can lay down your casket or your resting place, which is where you can go to either avoid the sun for a little while or maybe even change your appearance once you get the mirrors built, to name just a few things. Another big portion of the castle is tracking down your V-Blood enemies. Now, believe it or not, there is technically a story to this game, and it is about the V-Blood. Basically, a while back, Dracula was killed in the midst of a somewhat two-way war where humans were being mercilessly slaughtered left and right, and there were many civil wars between the vampires themselves that led to humans discovering their salvation via the power of the light, which they used to drive the vampires back, and ultimately wound up killing Dracula. Being Dracula, though, he had a contingency plan for something like this, and upon his death, it triggered a sort of blood rain that lasted several days, but the blood itself was contaminated. It infected all sorts of people around the landscape, turning them into V-Blood carriers, granting them extraordinary powers that we, being a vampire, would like to take from them the old-fashioned way. This is how we're going to gather the power and necessary knowledge to challenge Dracula himself as the endgame. Now, in order to take on these V-Blood enemies, which serve as little mini-boss fights, you have to craft all sorts of gear. Now, for the most part, gear is very linear in this game. Certain levels of gear do have a few different variations and options that will adjust some of your stats, but not to a hugely significant degree. But your overall player power is based on the things that your character has equipped, which comes down to, of course, their actual armor, but also their weapons, which also serve as your gathering tools, and keeping that up to date with the current tier of equipment you have available to then take on more V-Blood enemies to unlock more and more research and building opportunities to do more forms the basic gameplay loop. And for the most part, I think it's pretty solid. There are, I would say, a few moments here and there where it can be a tiny bit annoying to have to deal with a certain boss before you get slightly better equipment, or scrounging a particular resource from out in the wild before you've learned how to make it back at your own base, which would save you a bunch of headache, and just little things like that that I think could be smoothed out but aren't realistically that big of a deal. But there are some hiccups here and there along that basic progression curve. But another big thing you get from defeating these V-Blood enemies are your basic vampire powers as well as magic. Now, the powers you get from defeating specific enemies in particular, and this is going to do things like allow you to transform into various animals like a wolf, a bear, or later on you can even just masquerade as a full-blown human, as typically speaking, the humans wandering around the map will attack you on sight, but that will allow you to hide from them, and even interact with them to a degree beyond just dominating them as servants. And in that way, the game has a surprising amount of sort of dynamic elements that can change how you interact with any given area based on the vampire powers that you have available to you. And I would say that that is a pretty neat idea overall, especially in combination with some of the new dynamic world events, such as the rifts in the in-game area, the Ruins of Mortium, which functions a little almost like a standard action RPG style in-game, or simply the V-Blood enemies that actually wander around set locations on the map, which can lead to other interesting effects. So there's ways you can use those powers to interact with the world in ways you might not initially expect that are fun to mess around with and find out about. Now, the enemies themselves are a little hit or miss. I think some of them are pretty cool. Others are extremely basic, others are downright annoying, as each of them serves as a sort of mini-boss. And given that each and every one of them has progression locked behind them, if you're having trouble with a specific mechanic, that might lead to a bad time. Now, one of the things locked behind these enemies is unlocks for your magic abilities. You see, in addition to our vampire powers, defeating these enemies sometimes grants you a specific school of magic unlock, which of course grants you a magic ability from that particular school of magic, such as Frost or Blood, and that's going to form some of the abilities you can use in combat. Another aspect of that is that the higher tiers of equipment come with abilities for that particular weapon that you're using. And much later on in the game, you can even get unique weapons, etc. that have like special abilities you can activate, which I thought was cool. And both those little mini boss fight mechanics, the mechanics on just regular old enemies as well, your magic abilities, the abilities on weapons, armor, things like that, make it a decently fun ARPG at the same time. I will say it probably doesn't quite raise itself to the heights of something like a more dedicated ARPG, but it's still a very fun experience. Now to sort of start wrapping this up, I think Vrising is incredibly fun the first time you go through it, but in doing so, you'll probably realize that you can get basically everything on that character, which means that if you want to play a slightly different way or try out different combinations of spells, etc., you can absolutely do that, and you don't have to roll up a character or start that again for any reason. And because the world is static, the enemies you need to fight are static, most of the gear you make yourself, etc., there's really not a ton of, I would say, replayability, which means I don't think the seasonal thing for this particular game that ARPGs tend to like to do would quite work out, frankly. And given that all of the official servers have that like every so often server reset, makes it to where one of the big reasons to play this game for long periods of time beyond just that first run is effectively the multiplayer, which is one of the reasons I didn't want to do a full review for this one personally, because my overall thoughts about this game are essentially that for somebody like myself who doesn't have any interest in multiplayer, is that it's really fantastic to run through the game one time, build up your castle, make this really strong vampire, fight all these enemies, these unique fun little boss fights here and there. But once you're done with that, that's pretty much it. If you don't really want to hang out and engage with other players, it just didn't really feel like there was much else for me to do beyond that point. And while just getting to that point will potentially take you a substantial amount of time, depending on, of course, your game settings, whether or not you're actually playing solo, etc. And given that the game itself is only $35, I think the value proposition there is great. It's also pretty clear to me that one of the core things this game wants to do, which is the multiplayer scene, just isn't for me, but otherwise it's a cool game and I think it's a lot of fun. Which I think is about the appropriate place to end this particular video. So I certainly hope you enjoyed it, hope you found it informative. Do, of course, let me know how you feel about it down in the comments section below, which naturally means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom, and have an amazing day.